Once you've inserted data into a database table, the next natural thing you'd like to do is retrieve and display it. I'm working in a new version of the project called Retrieve Data. In this project's data source class, I already have the code to add new rows. It's called the create method. And now I'll add code to retrieve all rows and all columns of the same database table. I'll start at the top of the class. I'll define a constant, which will be an array of strings. The array will contain one string for each column in the database table. I'll create it here as a private, static final field. I'll data type it as string with open and close bracket, which means it's an array, and I'll name it all columns. I'll set it using a pair of braces, and then within the braces, I'll define a comma delimited list of all of my column names. The column name constants are in my OpenHelper class. So I'll start off with tours DB OpenHelper, and then I'll start with the primary key column, column ID, and I'll add a comma. Now I'll duplicate that line of code 4 times. And then I'll go back and change the column names. I'll include the title, and the description, and the price, and the image. I don't need the last comma, and I'll close up this code and add the semicolon at the end, and now I have an array of strings that I can use that identifies all of the columns of my database table. Next, I'll create a new method in my data source class that I'll name findAll. It'll retrieve all columns, all rows, and return them as a list of tour objects. I'll scroll down to the bottom of the class, and I'll add this new code after the create method. As with all of these methods, it'll be public, so that it can be called from anywhere in the application. It'll return a list of tours. I'll type in the name of the list class, then I'll press Control Space and choose the class to add the import, and I'll set the data type of its members to tour. That's my custom class. The name of the method will be findAll, and it won't receive any arguments. The first 2 steps in the findAll method are to define the list object and then to query the database. I'll create a list of tour objects, which I'll name tours, and I'll instantiate it with the ArrayList constructor method. Next, I'll query the database. You can query the database either using the executeSQL method for a raw query, or for a simpler approach, to query a single table in the database, you can use a method called query. If you need to do something more complex, such as joining tables together, you might need to use another method called raw query. I'm going to be querying just the single table, the tours table, so I'll use the query method. The query method returns an instance of a class called cursor. If you're familiar with JDBC programming in Java, the cursor class is similar to the result set class. It's a reference to the data that's returned from the query. I'll start by typing the name of the class, and then I'll import it from the android.database package. And I'll name the object cursor, and I'll assign it by calling the database query method. I'll type in database and press period, and that opens a list of all the methods of the database object. Notice that there are a few different signatures for the query method. I'll use the second one that starts with the name of the table. For the table name, I'll use a constant of my OpenHelper, tours DB OpenHelper.table_tours. Then for the columns, I'll pass in my array of strings that I just finished defining, named all columns. All of the rest of these arguments can be set to null. If you like, you can add filters in a couple of different ways, and you can group by and order by. But I'm just going to accept the default order, so I'll type in null for each of these values. And I'll do a little bit of code wrapping to make it a little bit easier to read. Once you've executed the query, you can immediately find out how many rows were returned by using a method of the cursor object called getCount. I'll do some logcat output. I'll use the log class and its I method. I'll pass in my logtag constant, and then a message starting with the string returned, and I'll concatenate cursor.getCount, and I'll finish the message with a string of rows. Now remember, this method needs to return a list of tour objects, so I need to loop through the cursor and deal with one row at a time. Again, if you're familiar with JDBC, you might remember that in a result set, the cursor starts before the first row, and the same thing is true of the SQLite cursor object in Android. So first, I'm going to add some conditional code. I'll use an if statement, and I'll check the count and make sure that it's greater than 0, using the expression if cursor.getCount is greater than 0. Then, if this condition is true, I'll loop through the rows. I'll use a while loop here. I'll type while and press Control space, and I'll loop with a condition. The condition will be a call to the method moveToNext. This is similar to the JDBC result set's next method. I'll type in cursor dot, and I see a listing of available methods. There's an isAfterLast and an isBeforeFirst, and an isFirst and an isLast, and so on, and I'll choose moveToNext. It returns a Boolean value, and if it successfully moves to a new row, it'll return true, and if it's already finished with the loop, it'll return false. So then, if I successfully move to a new row, I'll create a new instance of the tour class, which I'll name tour. Then I'll grab the values from the cursor one at a time, using methods of the cursor object that are unique to each data type. So for example, I'll start with tour.setID, and I'll pass in the following code, cursor.getLong. Remember, in a previous exercise, I set the data type of my ID property of the tour object as a long, and so I'll call the getLong method now to set the data type correctly. For the column index that's being requested, you should always call a method called getColumnIndex and pass in the name of the column. The code looks like this, cursor.getColumnIndex, and then pass in the column name, which in this case will be toursdbopenhelper.columnID. And so that's all the code you need to retrieve a single value of the correct data type and then pass it into a model object. I'll duplicate this code once, and then for the new version, I'll call the setTitle method of the tour object. When I retrieve the data, instead of setting the data type as long, I'll set it as a string. And then at the end of the call, I'll change the name of the column that I'm retrieving from column ID to column title. I'll duplicate that line of code twice, and I'll retrieve both the description and the image. For the description, I'll call the tour object's setDescription method. I'm already using a string, so I don't need to change the data type, but I do need to change the name of the column to column_DESC. Then I'll do the same thing for the image. I'll change setTitle to setImage, and I'll change the name from title to image. And finally, I need to deal with the price. I'll go back to the code that's calling setID. I'll duplicate it. I'll move it down a few lines, and I'll change the name of the set method call to setPrice. I'll change the data type from getLong to getDouble, and I'll change the name of the database column to column_price. So that's all the code I need to loop through the cursor, retrieve one row at a time, and then add the row's data to the tour object. At the end of all this code, I'll take that tour object and add it to my list of tours. Using tours.add, and I'll add the tour object. Finally, at the end of the loop, I'll return the list object. I'll place the cursor after the entire conditional clause and add return tours. I see an error indicator showing me that I've missed a semicolon, so I'll add it there. And all the errors are cleared, and it looks like it's good to go. I'll save these changes, and now I'll go back to my main activity. In my main activity, I'm currently getting the data from an XML file, using the XML pull parser to parse the XML file and getting back a list of tours. I'm going to comment that out, and instead I'm going to get the list of tours from my database. I'll move the cursor down here to after the call to open the data source. I'll declare my list of tours, once again calling it tours, and this time I'll call datasource.findAll. If this is the first time I've run the application, there might not be any data in it, so I'll add a conditional clause. And I'll check the size of the tours object. If tours.size has a value of 0, then I'll take this createData method and I'll move it into the conditional block, and then I'll make a copy of this code and I'll re-execute it. The second time I call it, I don't need to redeclare the list. It's already declared. So now the entire logic is I'll retrieve all the data. If there isn't any data there, I'll create the data and then I'll retrieve it again. And from that point forward, everything should work exactly the way I want. I already have the code to create an array adapter and then to pass in the list of tours and display it on the screen. So let's see how we did. I'll run the application in the emulator. If this is the first time the application is run, it'll create the data, and if it's not the first time, it'll just read the existing data. And there's the result. The 3 tours that I created displayed on the screen instead of the data that was retrieved from the XML file. So that's the code you need to retrieve data for display in your application. Again, you put all the code into your data source class, wrap it up in public methods, and then you'll be able to retrieve the data from anywhere in the application.